So jumping down to our response questions. Why do you think the Jews were so successful in the modern capitalist economy? What do you think were the most important factors in their success?
We're involved in those professions.
Okay, so the niche professions they were in were valuable in this time?
Well, one of the things you said that there's a lot of urban Jews,
Mm-hmm.
so they are already in position. The cities are where things are happening. It's not the old landed aristocracy that's in charge, except maybe in Prussia. But I think also the Jews, finance is an area that Jews were permitted to be in the Middle Ages. Is one of the reserved occupations for them. And so it was easy for them to move into the modern bourgeois economy of the capitalism of the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th.
Right. It's like the introverts during COVID lockdowns have been saying, we've been training for this our whole lives. We're so excited to be sitting at home alone. Well, sort of the Jewish economic niche is, we've been training our whole economic careers for being the middleman and running between, producer and supplier and adding value. And now it's finally paying off.
There's also something about not being tied emotionally to the kind of cultural expectations where the Jews were formerly disadvantaged. There's not that conservatism. There's more of a willingness to go forward into something new because something old was so bad and wasn't appealing. So there was a psychological liberation.
Absolutely. There's a reason why millions of Jews left the shtetl. The shtetl sucked. It was miserable. It was cold. It was poor. It was dangerous. They left because of all the opportunities that the modern economy in the cities and in other countries provided them.
And by the way, I am one of those computer programmers who's been planning for this all my life.
Right.
I'm one of them. You can call me anytime and I'll tell you how wonderful it is.
Yes.
It's also, I think, relevant that in places like Russia, for example, the Jews weren't serfs in the same way that the Russian Orthodox Christian peasants were. So they weren't tied to landowners. They weren't tied to villages where they'd been. There was more of a willingness to move out when restrictions were lifted. They went, hey, we can do things. And then they were willing to go and do them for the most part. But what I don't understand is why my family wasn't anything in this. They're sort of poor schmucks in the shtetls. I don't get that.
Well, they're there too, I mean, we think about, the successes of the people in the cities are the ones that are high profile. But there are still thousands of Jews who are laboring in, old professions. I mean, remember the movie Fiddler on the Roof is not a documentary, but it includes a lot of interesting detail. And it's set in the 19th century. Remember, the tailor gets a sewing machine. And he's so excited to get the sewing machine. And look what the sewing machine can do for me. Little does he know that sewing machine is going to land him in a sweatshop working, how many hours a day in a factory setting that's miserable. But it'll be much more productive and people will have more mass-produced clothes. He'll lose the dignity of the individual artisan, but his production will go up tremendously. But it's the railroad is in that movie, which takes the daughter thousands of miles away to Siberia, and then takes Tevye also in the other direction into America. You have the newspaper, which only one person in town can read, but it gives them news of the outside world. So we think of Fiddler on the Roof as a story about tradition, but it's also about how the people that wanted tradition found it undermined, a little bit here and a little bit there, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then they have to leave the shtetl either by expulsion or by attraction. They're pulled by ideas or by opportunity. Any other thoughts on Jewish success? Remember, they were literate. That makes a big difference. When the professions of law and medicine were open to them, once they were secularized and taken out of the church, they were attracted into those sort of white-collar, literate, writing, knowledge-based professions as opposed to physical labor. They did have international context too. That old advantage of Jewish international merchants was still there, and having the mobility and the willingness to move, I think, also, as people pointed out, makes a big difference.
Yeah, Adam.
Yeah.
I mean, if exactly. If you look at even Shakespeare, look at Merchant of Venice, which not only reflected the view of the times, but because Shakespeare is such an iconic author, that's a work that's perpetuated all the way through. And I don't necessarily think they discuss anti-Semitism, when they're teaching it.
Well, the interesting thing is that Shakespeare might have never known anybody who was Jewish, or at least explicitly Jewish, because Jews weren't allowed in England during the Elizabethan period. Someone's asking about, did the movement of Jews create a certain culling, like many immigrants are the ones with the wherewithal to make a move? That's fair enough, that there's sort of a selection bias. The people who were willing to move, those are the ones who were willing to move. And the ones who didn't move were the ones who weren't willing to move. And actually, sometimes the bias was the opposite direction. You'd think that the people who have money are the ones who are able to afford to move. But sometimes the people who have money are the ones who don't want to move. Life is good, right? They have assets, they have, they're successful. So why would they move? It's the dirt poor ones that scrape together the money to move. And that's why a lot of Jewish families that did move to America or to Western Europe from Eastern Europe would send one person over who would be earning money and sending money back so that the next person could come over. And they would gradually bring over the whole family every couple of years as they earned enough money to do it. But those are the poor ones moving, not the rich ones who have assets. Okay, we'll talk more about that when we talk about the American Jewish experience. Second question, how did modern racialist anti-Semitism differ from medieval religious anti-Judaism?
Well, you can change your religion. You can't change your racial or family or ethnic background. So
you can try.
You can try, yeah. Somebody like Hitler will not care. So it's what you can control and what you can't.
I mean, Jews have tried changing names, changing noses, changing where they live, changing their accent, but it's tough to change your grandfather. And if people are going to blame you on pedigree, then it's tough to change that too. Other features of the medieval anti-Judaism, well, it was opposition to the religious community, and the individual could be saved by conversion. Like you can get out, you can escape. And the attacks were mostly against religious beliefs and practices, where Jews were persecuted and encouraged to convert. But I'll be honest, the killing was less frequent because the goal was to convert them. It was not to wipe them out or to kill them. Sometimes they were expelled, but often they were able to live there just in a subordinate position, as we talked about in the medieval Ashkenazi Jewish experience. However, in the later Middle Ages, as the Jews become more demonized, you get the host desecration accusations, the blood libels. Then as the Jews become more demonic, then can a baptismal font really wipe out your Jewishness when you're that evil, when you're that foreign and other? That's where the racialist component begins to creep in. And then in the modern version, obviously, we have a much more racialized version where your Jewishness is ineradicable. It's just who you are. And ironically, the most dangerous Jew is the one who looks the least Jewish, because they're the one that's going to pollute the race blood. They're going to, infiltrate their corrupt DNA into the bloodlines, and you get this sort of, racialist vision not only of Jews but also of the Aryan or the national identity as the anti-Jew. And the Jews were seen as behind both capitalism and communism. And the solution to the Jewish question, that idea of the final solution, that phrase final solution comes back to this issue of the Jewish question, which goes back in European thought for 50 years before the Holocaust. Well, what do we do with these Jews? Do we restrict them? Do we expel them? Do we kill them all? In the end, all of those are tried in Europe in that time period.
I think one thing that's sort of ironic about the whole thing is that with the progress of science and the beginning of the classification of races, this becomes a kind of way to classify groups of people that you are now this race, and it doesn't matter what you do with your religion or anything else, you're always this race. And that's an idea that is sort of foreign before science starts creating these things. And honestly, race slavery had a lot to do with that, starting in the 15th century, where in order to enslave all these Africans, you had to make them somehow subhuman or different from yourself. And that it grew from that point. It grew from that point.
Yeah, ironically, it's a post hoc justification, right? Like they had Africans in slavery, and then they came up with the racialist thought to justify what they were already doing.
Yeah, well, and anthropology was used as a weapon rather than, you know, to do this. And in the 20th century, it gets very bad. I mean, when I was young, you know, we were taught, oh, the three great races of mankind: Mongoloid and Negroid, and, you know, well, that's nonsense, but that's what we got taught.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, number 3, what were some of the sources of non-Jewish resentment that contributed to modern anti-Semitism, and do they still exist? Well, this is the Jewish success is unfair. They must be cheating, right? There's no way they could be this successful by playing fair, and so they must have rigged the game. They're too successful in this new economy. When you're fresh off the farm in the misery of the urban proletariat, and you see people who are successful, who are the people who should be on the bottom, you start to think that the game is rigged against you. And the Jews are the foreigners, the strangers who are controlling the native economy and culture. And they're even the atheists who are corrupting traditional value and culture for modernity and its meager payoffs. Now, is that still a problem we deal with? Go ahead.
And I want to say that something that I'm sure exacerbated that was the tendency of humans to you notice things more that don't fit your established expectations. So the fact that, you know, in a lot of these things, the vast majority of people were, you know, whatever your dominant group was, were in the positions of power. You don't notice those because that's what you expect. What you notice is the, you know, smaller number, but much higher than you expect, Jews who are in the places you don't expect them. And so it gets magnified in your mind that, you know, well, all the powerful people are Jews and keeping me down, because that's what you notice.
Right. You know, the irony is, if, let's say, you know, 40% of Jews were working in business in Berlin in 1935 or whatever, they were still a small percentage of the total number of businessmen working in Berlin. You know, just because the proportion of the population was small, just because a lot of them were doing it, doesn't mean they represented the overwhelming majority of people in that profession in that area or place.
It's like you never hear people commenting on, you know, oh my gosh, you know, that's a WASP who's, you know, owning a multi-billion-dollar company. It's like, yeah, no, we expect that. People only comment when, you know, oh, it's a woman, or, you know, it's some not rich, straight, white Anglo-Saxon male who's in a position of power.
Yeah.
You know? We don't notice them. They just blend into the background because they're expected.
They're just people as opposed to everybody else. Okay. So are these problems we still deal with today? Well, I think so. We're not always the only scapegoat anymore. You know, sometimes it's the immigrant, and sometimes it's the transgender person, and sometimes it's the you know, whoever the enemy du jour is. But Jews are still included on that enemies list. Al, you're going to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, what about the term Hollywood elite? I always kind of get queasy about that, you know.
Right. Well, that's, again, you know, the undermining of traditional values, accusation, the illegitimately acquired money, the corrupt business practices, the monopolization. I mean, all those accusations that have been applied in finance and business, and they're applied in Hollywood too, especially the pernicious undermining of culture. Do you remember this thing called the Hays Code that was in place controlling movies from the 1930s through the 1970s or so? The irony was, it was the people made fun of it. It was a Catholic priest telling Jewish filmmakers how to make movies for WASPs. But if you look at some of the movies made in the 1920s and 30s, there was sex and violence, sometimes even homosexual relationships presented in mainstream films. They were really pushing the envelope. And the Hays Code comes in, and you're not allowed to show a man and woman in bed together. Your kiss cannot last more than like 1 second with closed mouths. And they come up with all these rules of what you're allowed to do in a movie. Anybody who's a villain has to die, like has to be punished. You can't get away with it at the end of the film, because it was trying to impose this traditional morality on this corrupting cultural influence that was Hollywood. And Hollywood was, there were non-Jewish filmmakers in Hollywood, but many of the studio leaders were in fact Jews. And that became problematic later on, particularly after World War II, when the HUAC investigations focused on Hollywood and looked at the corruption of left-wing radicals, many of whom were also Jewish. And there were fears that that would undermine Jewish positions in America because of these prominent left-wing writers and so on in Hollywood.
I always found it somewhat ironic in things like Hollywood, filmmaking and comics and everything, industries that early on had a large percentage of Jewish people in them, and people, railing about that, especially Hollywood, because more people watch movies than read comic books. But when you look at it, I mean, the reason behind it was in a large part because so many Jewish people were prevented from entering these other more prestigious businesses, that they ended up being more likely to try out new things where they weren't these, quotas in place. And when they did go ahead and find something that was going well, they'd hire the talented people they knew, being able to get jobs at the prestigious places because they were Jewish.
Mm-hmm. And if you need writers, you need people who are literate, and who are a verbose people, and we know Jews are verbose. There's even people trying to defend the Jewish practice of interrupting other Jewish people as a cultural norm. That is just what Jews do. I still disagree, but that's my WASP assimilation, I guess. In any case, yeah. So this is still with us. These kind of accusations. Now, yeah,
I can make one comment to belabor the obvious, and we could go off on great tangents. Some of the rhetoric that has been applied against Jews is now being applied by certain identifiable elements in our culture against any opposition. For instance, the whole idea of a rigged system and a rigged election, and down to the details that the blood libel is resurfacing in some of the QAnon conspiracy theories, that children are being killed and politicians are drinking their blood. We're seeing all of this applied not just against the Jewish other, but against any other than those who would try to impose a certain direction on our culture.
Thus, question number 5. Do you believe that anti-Semitism is a major problem for Jews today? Why or why not? Well, I mean, you could argue both sides, right? Anti-Semitism changes, morphs into new circumstances. There's still occasional violence that takes place, and sometimes worse. The shootings in the synagogue in Pittsburgh and in Poway in California. If you look at the statistics, though, I mean, popular attitudes are much less anti-Semitic today than they used to be. If you ask people, do Jews control the banks? Far fewer would say yes now than did in 1964, to pick another year. The ADL did a survey. I'll show you their questions at the end that they would ask. So by many measures, Jews can join country clubs, they can move into any neighborhood. You used to have a Jewish law firm because you couldn't join the white collar WASP law firms, and that barrier has fallen. So a lot of the barriers are down. I mean, if nothing else, the rise in the rate of intermarriage is a sign of the decrease in anti-Semitism, because they wouldn't marry us if they all hated us.
But the barriers compared to other groups, immigrants, Muslims, gays, are blacks still, are so much greater than the limits and the anti whatever that exists still today against Jews. Jews lot as being the scapegoat is so much less than so many of these other groups that have suffered from prejudice.
I will point out there's overlap though, because there are Black Jews, there are immigrant Jews, there are, gay Jews, so sometimes you have a multitude of intersections of these oppressive categories that affect the Jewish community too. Jews aren't all white, right? But those Jews who are white have often been able to pass as white. Certainly post-World War II, there was a whole series of housing discrimination cases where they struck down clauses that banned Jews from buying property. Interesting side note, when the Supreme Court decided that issue about these restrictive covenants or clauses in real estate, at least two of the justices had to recuse themselves from the case because their house had a restrictive covenant on it that wouldn't allow it to be sold to a Jewish person. So that's how widespread this practice was, that the Supreme Court justices themselves had to recuse themselves. And the people who wrote the Justice Department's brief on behalf of striking down the law, it was all Jews who drafted it, but only one of them put their name on it because they didn't want to see all these Jewish names on the brief as if it was only Jews interested in it for Jewish benefit. And yet residential segregation on the basis of race continues even today, but certainly even in law, well into the 1960s, much more so than it did for Jews. Levittown, that famous, suburban development in New York, was race restricted. White Jews could get in, but not Black Americans.
Yeah, my neighborhood was built by Old Man Levitt in 1949, 1950 on Long Island. It wasn't Levittown, it was in Roslyn. But there was actually in every deed that was sold, it said you cannot sell to a Black person. But my neighborhood was also 99% Jewish, interestingly enough. I mean, the entire neighborhood was bought by Jews.
Yeah. So in the chat, we have a couple of comments about the Simon Wiesenthal Center writes about current anti-Semitic incidents every day. Now, I'll point out they're in the anti-Semitism business. Like that's what their focus is, so they're going to find them all. And someone else comments about certain anti-Semitic statements or comments that have worked their way into something called the Movement for Black Lives, which is separate from the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a different sort of jockeying for position there, in particular with regard to Israel and policing practices and so on that are taking place, or what's happening with the Palestinians there, and an accusation of genocide. Look, there are corners of every part of the American population that have some of these aspects in there. The head of the Philadelphia NAACP is one example, tweeted out a terrible anti-Semitic cartoon, and he was called out on it by his colleagues in the NAACP in Philadelphia. He ultimately had to resign his position. And I actually know one of the people who was involved in that process in calling him out on this, who himself is a Black Jew, and it runs an organization called Jews in All Hues. So, it's these intersecting alliances can be to our benefit too, but we have to understand that just as there are anti-Semites who identify with the right wing of the political spectrum, there are anti-Semitic attitudes that land on the left of the political spectrum. There are going to be anti-Semitic incidents at cemeteries and graffiti. And again, we have to remember to distinguish between anonymous graffiti late at night and killing somebody in broad daylight. Both of those have happened in the last few years, but it takes a lot less chutzpah to, graffiti tag a headstone in the middle of the night than it does to attack a synagogue with guns. And they're just very different.
We actually saw an instance in our service when we had a guest speaker several months ago who reported anti-Semitism within some of the liberation movements, where those who wanted to carry a rainbow flag, I think, with a Jewish star were not allowed to march. And our speaker was willing to accept that in order to remain solid with the movement in that particular event. But the anti-Semitism within some of the liberation movements is where they're most mainstream. And it's certainly a vestige of a very traditional anti-Semitism that has been accepted and continues to be in many ways.
Well, one of the other complications has to do with the state of Israel, which is a new challenge in anti-Semitism because equating all Jews with Israel is one problem. On the other hand, we used to say we are one, and we have an Israel Solidarity Day that the Jewish Federation runs every year. And so are we or are we not? Like many synagogues put an Israeli flag on their bima, and some Jewish schools start the day singing Hatikva, as well as the Star Spangled Banner. There is that complication of Jewish nationalism and its relationship to its own minority population, in either the Israeli Arabs of Palestinian background or the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, that adds to complications with this. So in many cases, it's an anti-colonial attitude that's being applied to Israel. And the question is, does that cross the line or not? And we've often said, as we've discussed Israel here, that you're allowed to criticize Israel. It isn't automatically anti-Semitism, but there are times it crosses the line. And that example of the Dyke March, where they said that any kind of flag with a Jewish star on it was automatically Israeli nationalism and not allowed because it oppresses the indigenous, was a challenge. Now, some people also talk about college campuses. Again, you have to look at this by percentage. A lot of campuses have had proposed boycott, divestment, sanction initiatives. They failed almost everywhere. So if you read the anti-Semitism outrage industry, these things are being proposed at every campus. But if you look at the results, they fail almost all the time. So is this a wave of anti-Semitism striking campuses? Well, A, I'm not convinced that every BDS resolution is motivated by eliminationist, murderous, anti-Jewish sentiment. And B, they lose almost all the time. So which is the case? Is it a flailing? Is it a political movement that hasn't made enough allies? Or is it a wave of anti-Semitism? Well, it depends who you're going to ask about this. So look, discussing about whether anti-Semitism is a major problem, a minor problem, or a growing problem, that's its own program worth exploring. I just wanted to touch on the topic, having looked at this historical perspective, to keep in mind that you don't have mayors today like Karl Lueger in Vienna. You don't have major national political parties with explicitly anti-Semitic platform items. You had those in Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so that on that level of measurement, we're in a different place. Today the police protect the synagogues. They don't attack the synagogues like they did in Kristallnacht and in Nazi Germany. So the only other question we're going to touch on today is on the importance of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and what's different and continuous. Again, it essentializes the Jews. Unlike most Christian anti-Semitism, a Jew remains a Jew and is a hidden menace, even if they appear integrated. And the Jews are now behind different kind of corruptions of society, not the desecration of the host or the killing of a Christian child, but it's the new economics, it's the modern social movements. They proclaim equality, but it's just a plot to take over. They say everybody's equal, so that everybody has equal rights, which lets the Jews take advantage because of their deviousness. It's the fake fair game that they've rigged in their benefit. That's part of the accusation. And we still have that out there, and as a source people draw on, we saw that Hamas charter, that's 1988. That's not that long ago. And it still shows up there in the early 2000s. There was a TV drama done, like a miniseries done on Egyptian television, dramatizing the protocols of the Elders of Zion, part of the state-run TV media.
Rabbi,
yeah,
what do you think of the far right's conspiracy theories of George Soros in relation to the protocols of the Elders of Zion?
Yeah, I get in debates with people about this because there are people who are suspicious of globalism as an approach to life. They don't like multinational corporations who are tax farming for better tax treatments. They are shopping for lower environmental regulations. They don't like people who aren't tied to national allegiance, who have a home in Paris and a home in Lisbon and a home in New York, but they register for taxes in Lisbon because they don't pay any income tax there. And when they say globalists, they mean people like that. who are not allied to one national identity. The problem is that globalist begins to sound like the rootless cosmopolitan, the underminer of traditional values that was the anti-Jewish accusation. So there's a respectable critique of globalism, and there's the anti-Semitic tinged critique of globalism. And Soros often falls into that, spider pulling the strings from lots of different places kind of boogeyman role. Now, I mean, look, they could point to Warren Buffett or Bill Gates too, right? You want to talk about somebody who undermined traditional values, Bill Gates and his computers, or what's his name, Steve Jobs, right? Bill Gates and Steve Jobs with the computers have destroyed all kinds of traditional industries and values and national borders.
Well, Bill Gates is having his chip in your vaccination.
Ah, okay, so now they're at least being rational. No, but the point is, Soros is an easy boogeyman because he's foreign, right, born in Hungary, because he's other, maybe because he's Jewish, because he's super rich, and the super rich aren't like us. And, so he's othered in lots of ways. Sometimes it's anti-Jewish, sometimes it's just the boogeyman of the other side. Look, you can read stuff about the Koch brothers and liberal sites that talk about their pernicious influence in 17 different think tanks and all the laws through ALEC that they've promulgated. It's the parallel to Soros is talking about the evil of the Koch brothers.
But the difference is the Koch brothers are Jewish.
I understand, but they're plutocrats. And so we don't have the anti-Semitism part to it, but we still have the conspiracy thinking of the plutocrat. And again, I would get people who would say to me, well, no, but that one's true. That's real.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, see?
I do want to pause a cautionary note, though, at least from my opinion. I'm quite disturbed by you talk about there aren't any official parties that are anti-Semitic, that are running an anti-Semitic, but after the CPAC, convention this last weekend, the so-called Republican Party is not very far from endorsing, quite frankly, white supremacist theories and ideas. I mean, the people that attended that conference kind of comprise the basis of that party at this point. So there is concern. I am concerned about the nature of what the right wing is doing and how the anti-Semitism of the right wing is being manifested right now.
Well, see, the problem is, though, it's not universal anti-Semitism because there are good Jews from their perspective. The good Jews are right-wing nationalist Israelis like Netanyahu and Orthodox and modern Orthodox Jews like Stephen Miller, Ivanka Trump, and Jared Kushner. Those are the good Jews. The Jewish Republican Coalition, those are good Jews. And the bad Jews are the leftists, the secularists, the ACLU, the underminers of traditional values, the universalists, the globalists who don't like borders, the Mark Zuckerbergs, right, who are undermining community and censoring conservative thought. But the good Jews are still there. So it's not a universalist, like wipe out all the Jews anti-Semitism. It's a split the Jews into good Jews and bad Jews dynamic. And as much as they talk about Christian nationalism, they also are very eager to throw the label of anti-Semitism against anybody they don't like. They've weaponized that too.
Yeah.
So it's messy. It's just messy.
Yeah, it is messy, but I remain cautious at the moment. It's just, to me, it's a giant red flag, and it may go nowhere. There may be saner minds that will regain control of that area. But right now, they're flexing muscles that I've never seen flexed in this way in a very long time. Yeah,
and look, as debates go on the left wing too, there'll be questions about Israeli lobbying influence. And is it? I mean, you had that statement that Ilhan Omar put out that it's all about the Benjamins, and that's who, that's what decides people's foreign policy. And an even worse thing she said some years ago that she apologized for. So there are risks on both sides. And I will say, 20 years ago, when I first put this curriculum together, I was much more optimistic about where anti-Semitism was going. And it's much worse today than it was 20 years ago. And especially in countries like Hungary and Poland, in Russia, in other parts of the world, it is much uglier now on the anti-Semitic front than it used to be. So we should not be blithely optimistic that it's always going to go in a positive direction. Things can go backwards and much more quickly than we expect.